This episode of Love Larn is sponsored by Scott Bonnar Fabrication and Parts. So I've got here my self-aligning engine sprocket bearing. This guy sits on the PTO shaft up against the frame of the mower. The shaft passes through it and the sprocket sits on the outside of the mower frame. So this guy sits in here and it pivots and swivels in there to account for, I guess, any alignment issues. I believe these bearings are only used on the solid machines because the sides are bolted to the deck, whereas the twin machines are welded together, so the alignment in theory is 100%. This one's going into the 14 solid, the 14-inch solid, but one of these bearings came out of my 17-inch twin, so there you go. So what we're going to do today, I've cleaned out the inside of this bearing housing already. There was a bit of powder coating on there, so just rubbed that clean back to the metal with some sandpaper, probably a little bit coarser than it needed to be. I used 80 grit and then tidied up with a bit of 180 or something. Probably could have been a bit more patient and used something finer, but nonetheless the job's done, and this bearing is pretty much ready to press into there. So we'll do that in a little while. The first thing that I want to do, however, is get some grease in amongst the balls of the bearing itself. So pop that back out of there. As usual, I'm using the moly grease, and I don't have any specific tools for packing it in there, so I'm using a grotty old toothbrush, which also happens to be my moly grease toothbrush. And what I'm going to do, to the best of my abilities, is basically just pack as much grease into there as possible and get it nice and tight until it won't accept any more. Having never done this before, all I can say is there's probably a better way. Nonetheless, I thought I'd illustrate it for you guys. It's going to be a bit of a messy job, but whatever. I was reading a little bit about grease the other day, greases, and specifically compatibilities between greases and oils. So the reason I mention that is because the bearing housing that this guy sits in has a little oiler hole. And my thinking was, well, is moly grease, this lithium moly grease, compatible with whatever type of lubricant that we might want to periodically throw down that hole? So for example, engine oil, or a lithium grease, or 3-in-1 type oil, etc, etc, etc. The case that I was reading about was to do with I think a bearing joint on a boat trailer, and I guess the issue the guy had was he'd basically greased up his bearings, and all the grease sort of liquefied and ran out, and the comments on that thread suggested that the issue was to do with an incompatibility between whatever grease or oil was already in there, essentially causing the grease to change in property and liquefy and come out. So we'll just get a little bit in there as well, or a lot, This thing's already pretty slippery anyway, and I'm just going to pop that in there, try and line it up, and we'll see if it's going to go home, and it is. That means we don't even have to press that in there. It's probably a little bit looser than it ought to be, but it's going to be bolted in there, with the bolted to the frame as I mentioned, and there'll be the little washer, the little rubber washer in there as well. It's not going to go anywhere, and once the shaft's passing through it as well, it should be okay. I do have the option then, I suppose, of cleaning this out and putting some sort of Loctite in there, but I don't think I'm going to do that just yet. We'll see if there's an issue once we're reassembled, and maybe go from there. So there we go. One grotty toothbrush and one seated and oiled or greased bearing ready to go. The next thing I'm going to do is get this bearing housing in place. Obviously I've got the bearing in there, I've got some grease in that bearing as well. It's a self-aligning bearing that sort of swivels on all sorts of different axes to ensure that that shaft is running smoothly and true, regardless of how the frame itself has been put together. Obviously the solid decks are screwed together rather than being welded, so you're ensuring that that alignment is a little bit more important than on the twins. I've also put a little rubber seal in there just to keep the junk out of that bearing as best as possible. And I've got our two bolts which pass through from the outside of the machine, outside of the side of the machine specifically, and then through the two holes, and then we bolt them on from the back side. Now you'll see me threading these through because I've got paint through the side and through the bearing housing as well. And I just found as well these little bearing housings, I don't know if they're threaded, but they certainly seem like they're threaded. So I'll just run those through as best we can. There we go, and we've got a little shake-proof washer, a star washer I guess, and a bolt, which we'll have to retrieve on each one of those. And of course we'll come back and snug those up in due course. The next bearing we need to press belongs on the inside of this clutch half. It's the engine side clutch half. And this is the bearing that fits in there. It's curved on the one side and drops in there like that. So it's going to be an interference fit in here, so it's going to take a little bit of pressing to get in there, similar to the other bearings. A little bit of moly on here is going to just help things along, and presumably that bearing's going to be in there for a long time, and it's possible it may need to come out again at some point in the future. So a little bit of moly in there just to provide a little bit of lube while it's sliding in, and to keep it from seizing up over time as well. Just get that just loosely in place and fairly well aligned, hopefully. Square to the cup so it can slide in there. As an experiment the other day, I popped this bearing in the freezer, and it was a very close fit. It went sort of part of the way in, so I know it's going to go. Just get that whole little pancake in there and start squeezing. Let's see. There we you go. It's a tight one. It's going home. Another little crank, and that should get it as far as we're going to get it, with nothing else sitting on top of there. So the next thing I need to do is open this vise out a little bit and just get a socket in there again, to give us a little tiny bit of extra focus, I guess. So that the vise can close up tight against it. This is when you could really use an extra pair of hands. I just want to get that bearing right into the cup. It should sit just a little bit sort of further below the surface. I'm just gauging that by eye, but and feel. Hopefully you can see that sitting, I don't know, maybe 2.5, even 3 millimeters down into that cup. And just a closer inspection, it's difficult to see, you know, looking in from here, so whether it's actually seated, but I think that's going to do the trick today.